My talk is framed within a larger philosophical debate that has mainly revolved around the question of whether the we is a primitive and unconditioned phenomenon or whether it is a developmental achievement that has a dyadic form of joint intentionality as its necessary precondition. In this contribution, I'm going to defend a thesis that mainly sides with this latter view, but also adds some complexities. What I mean is that I shall not choose dyadic forms of we as my point of departure, but I shall focus on far more complex configuration of the we that involve the plural position of you and they. My basic thesis is that in order to account for the genesis of this far more complex configuration of the we, one needs to shift the theoretical focus from the you to the third. That is more precisely from a dyadic relation of reciprocity between I and you to a constellation involving the figure and the function of a third party. That is a member who behaves as a representative of the group to which he belongs. This hypothesis drew inspiration from Sartre's theory of practical ensemble, whose analysis of the genesis of the so-called fused group are focused on the key role and importance of a third party. To avoid I argue that in this fascinating and somehow forgotten book of the Critique of Dialectical Reason, Sartre made a significant contribution to the attempt to conceptualize the minimal and therefore necessary condition of emergence of a group behavior and of group thought. A contribution that any contemporary discussion about the genesis of the we should take into account. To avoid a misunderstanding, it is important to emphasize that the third party in this context is to be understood as a third agent or as an internal observer rather than as an external enemy or as a realm of beings, such as an object of joint attention or a shared common project. The third party is another other whose function differs from the first other or the alter ego. The third party is another other who signify the identity and the tendencies of the group, therefore giving rise to social configuration that cannot be fully explained by reference to the dyadic model of ego and alter ego. To quickly outline the structure of my talk, in the first section I will recall some elements of the dyadic model by considering Xavier recent proposal in some detail. In the second section, I will go back to Sartre's account and attempt to reconstruct his argument for shifting the theoretical focus from dyadic relation of reciprocity to ternary relation of mediated reciprocity involving the figure and the function of a third party. In the final move, I will explore the epistemological and heuristic potential of this alternative framework for contemporary debate on the genesis of the we. So let me start by considering the dyadic model in some detail. According to a prominent and recently emerging view supported by both philosophical arguments and empirical evidence, a we perspective arises out of a dyadic I-U relation involving a special kind of reciprocity, one that requires the capacity to adopt a second-person perspective. And to adopt a second-person perspective means more concretely I quote, to be aware of the other and at the same time to be implicitly aware of oneself as attended to or addressed by the other. To quickly summarize Dan Zavi's argument, I quote, the experience of being engaged in a we required that I experience and internalize the other's perspective on myself, that I take over the apprehension that others have of me. As important as this argument might be, one obvious limitation lies in that it typically applies to dyadic forms of we, which are bounded to the here and now of a concrete face-to-face bodily interaction between two pairs of individuals. And this is something Dan Zavi is perfectly aware of. But what then if the we connect simultaneously multiple individuals far from each other and unknown to each other, who nonetheless recognize one another as part of the same community? What if the we arises out of far more complex, polycentric, and also mediated social configuration? The perspective changes indeed if one accepts the task of developing a model to account for the complexity of the social relation involved in this far more complex configuration of the we, involving the plural position of you and they. The theory of the third party, as worked out by Jean-Paul Sartre in The Critique of Dialectical Reason, seems to me to represent such an alternative in the current philosophical landscape. To retrace and extract Sartre's argument for shifting the theoretical focus from dyadic relation of reciprocity to ternary relation of mediated reciprocity involving a third party, I suggest reading Sartre's work through the following question. First, who is the third party, and what kind of relationship does it bring about among group members? Second, why is the third party important, and what kind of we does it bring about? What are the arguments for taking the third party into consideration? And third, what are the consequences for and the benefit to the current debate on the we in taking ternary relation of mediated reciprocity into consideration? I will therefore starting by answering my first question, who is the we and what kind of relationship does it bring about among group members? Without any doubt, the third party may wear different masks and play different roles. It is important to avoid a misunderstanding. It is important to emphasize that the third party, as elaborated by Sartre, is to be understood as a third agent or as an internal observer, rather than as an external enemy or as a realm of being, such as a shared object of joint attention or a common project. The third party is another whose functions are different from the first other, or the alter ego, and which is conceived in such a way that the addition of a fourth or fifth member doesn't change the functionality of the schema involving the I, the you, and the multiple third party. The third party is another who signifies the identity and the tendencies of the group to which it belongs. By third party, Sartre means more precisely a temporary leader who acts as if the group were acting within him. He found himself in the situation where, by acting in the name of the group, he induces all the other members to act immediately in the name of the same group, and thereby organize the plurality of people that surrounds him. As creator of objective and organizer of meaning, he stands in a tense and contradictory relation of transcendence and immanence, in that it cannot be isolated, neither from the world group nor from the intersubjective dyad, even when he acts as a temporary leader and monitor their interaction on the behalf of a larger community. That's why I quote, from a structural point of view, the third party can be defined as the human mediation through which the multiplicity of epicenter and ends organize itself directly as determined by a synthetic objective. The sovereign function of a third party then passes immediately to another individual in the group, who, acting freely on the behalf of the larger community, assume in turn this function in an endless process of grouping. At this level, there emerges a movement of mediated reciprocity between two third parties who come together in the generating movement of the group. Each does not act in the name of the other in front of him. He acts in the name of the group that does not yet exist, and to which he gives rise at the very moment as he acts as its representative. And here there emerged the first we, which is plural rather than singular and practical rather than substantial, because it emerges in the ubiquity of this movement of mediated reciprocity between several selves. But nonetheless still involves rather than eradicates the first person singular perspective, because it emerges in everyone from the free development of the common action, which is everywhere the same and everywhere common. Moreover, each subject who plays the role of a third party brings about a reciprocity of a new, distinctive kind that links the whole group to each individual inside it. The main reason of this new structure of mediated reciprocity lies precisely in the characteristic of mediation, which is neither an object, as I already said, nor an objective, but the group's action, I quote, laying down its own law in each third party. In this respect, the third party is that which makes it possible for the self to come into contact with the group's norms and their contingencies. The most important result of this structure of mediated reciprocity is a process of group identification, which alters the first person singular perspective insofar as everyone finds himself acting in a completely new way. I quote, not as an individual nor as other, but as an individual incarnation of the we or of the common person. According to Sartre, there is nothing magical in this result. In fact, it merely requires the internalization of a third-party perspective on the group, through which everyone perceives himself not only as in the person of the other, but also as an extension of the group of which he is about to become a part. In other words, whatever relation of simple reciprocity there are within a group, these relations, according to Sartre, are not constitutive of a group behavior and of group thought. What is needed is eternally the relation of mediated reciprocity, on the basis of which simple reciprocity becomes aware of itself as reciprocal connection, and therefore transforms a plurality of individuals in relation with each other into a group aware of itself as unity of individuals in solidarity. Without going in further detail of such very deep analysis, it is important for us to focus on the following 3 points. First, it is important to notice that the third party has a crucial role to play in the process of group identification, insofar as the internalization of a third party perspective is the basis on which emerge the first we, who cannot be attributed neither to a single individual nor to a collective consciousness, since, as we have seen, it emerges in the ubiquity of a movement of mediated reciprocity between several selves. In other words, what has to be seen as a key idea is not only the importance of the third as a mediation between the I and the plural position of you, but moreover the key role it plays in the process of group identification, by which everyone finds himself acting as an individual incarnation of the group. In the same vein, it is important to notice that the figure of the third is that which makes it possible the shifting from a we perspective experience to a we perspective reflexively assumed. Indeed, according to Sartre, the tendencies to experience oneself as part of a we increases and became aware when the gaze, the speech, or the action of a third person immanent to the group enters the scene and brings an element of awareness into the play. It is equally important to notice that the third is that which makes it possible for the self to come into contact with the group's norms and their contingencies. That's why the third party can be seen as a figure of transition, a sort of link holding together the social and normative level of human relationship. Let me now show why is the third party important within contemporary debate about the we. I shall here present 4 arguments for the relevance of the third. The third argument, which is the revision of what it is called in the literature the argument from the complexity of our social world, can be reformulated in the following terms. Our social reality is complex and varied, and includes within itself both dyadic formation and far more complex, large-scale mediated social configuration. Although a purely dyadic IU model bundles and covers different social relations, it cannot exhaust the complexity of our social reality. Think, for instance, of social phenomena such as family, skill, trade, and profession, where we found traces of the medieval triad of master, journeyman, and apprentice. Think also of law and court, political, and media institution. My argument is that one needs a triadic model to account for the complexity of the social relation involved in this far more complex social configuration that go far behind the here and now of a face-to-face interaction and involve the plural position of you and they. The triadic model, as worked out by Sartre, seems to me to represent such an alternative in the philosophical debate. It allows us to think how a plurality of heterogeneous you can be linked in reciprocity even in the absence of any specific relation, even if they don't know each other. At the same time, it gives us argument for considering the interlacing between dyadic and triadic relation or ternary relation, insofar as the third party cannot be isolated from the intersubjective dyads, but on the contrary, remain part of it. All in all, the theoretical significance of the ternary model lies in that it helps us to solve a crucial problem related to the diversity and complexity of our social world. The problem to know how the multiplicity of human agents realize in its very dispersal its interiorization. To be as clear as possible, I'm not claiming that the triadic model worked out by Sartre can be applied to account of all types of we. Of course, the theoretical schema sketched above is never completely applicable. The second argument, which could be provided for the relevance of the third party, is grounded on the intuition that there is a difference of a fundamental kind between dyadic forms of we, which links two pairs of individual, and more lasting, larger form of collective identity. The basic idea behind this argument is that a dyad can constitute only a very reflecting type of we, which forms and disintegrates quickly, because it has no collective identity apart from the two parties, its two parties. In other words, the collective identity of a dyad is bounded to the personalities of its two principal, I and you, as well as to the here and now of their relationship. Replacing one member of the dyad with another creates a new dyad, not a continuation of the old. On the other hand, it takes no more than 3 members to establish a collective identity capable of surviving to the replacement of one member by another. The general outline of my argument then is that one needs to introduce a third party as a tool in the analysis in order to account for the emergence of much larger and far more permanent forms of we, capable of surviving to the replacement of one member with another, and therefore describe not only how the we emerge, but also how it lasts. The third argument goes like this. Until now, it has been proven surprisingly difficult to develop an approach adequate to the challenge of thinking the relationship between the first person singular perspective and the first person plural perspective, even though it is generally assumed that the we involves rather than eradicates the first person singular perspective of the involved party. The theoretical significance of the third party lies in that it helps us to solve this crucial problem. It allows us to see that a we perspective has not a fixed, stable first-person singular perspective as its necessary precondition. Indeed, as we have seen, it emerged in the ubiquity of the movement of mediated reciprocity between several selves, but nonetheless still involve the first singular perspective because it emerges in everyone from the free development of the common action, which is everywhere the same and everywhere common, although played in different ways. The fourth argument can be expressed as follows. By a systematic consideration of the third party, the function of the third party, the nature of the we can be observed and described more precisely. It turns out that at a first level, the we is experienced rather than being reflectively assumed. It is only the figure of the third, both neutral and involved, inside and outside at the same time, observing and interfering, which brings an element of awareness into the play, through which a we perspective is reflectively assumed rather than being simply lived through. My argument is then the following. A third party drives and increases or sustains the process of group identification insofar as it makes it possible in each individual the internalization of a first-person plural perspective, and might be also understood as a way for the self to come into contact with the group's norms and their contingencies. Thank you for your attention.